My name is Janaki. I'm here on the faculty at IIIT. Like Bidisha, I teach in this domain called IT and Society here. And I have several interests. I've been working in this broad field of ICTs and development for over a decade now. And I've seen it go through various kinds of phases. There was a phase when there was a faith in community village centers. Uh, Over the last decade and a half, there's been a lot of faith placed in mobile phones and various iterations of mobile phones and what you can do with them. So I've seen some of that. Um, More recently, in the last couple of years or so, anyone who works in this broad space has come across this idea of the future of work and AI, and I confess that I have also been taken into that whole rhetoric. So the idea really is that I've also been teaching this course called Privacy with a couple of my colleagues. So what I'm going to try and do today is that we all come across a wide variety of claims about what data can do, as well as negative stories around things that haven't worked out, etc. And I've been struggling a little bit to try and see if there's a sort of broader understanding that we can draw out of this. And that's where I'm using this frame of an anti-politics machine. And what I'm hoping we can do today in conversation is to try and see if this frame A helps, B fits, 3, what are the kinds of cases where it fits? Maybe there are cases where it doesn't fit, right? So that is sort of the broad agenda. And at the end, I'll sort of tie it up to the notion of ethics as discussed yesterday and see where politics comes in that entire space. Any questions so far? All right. So we've all been hearing about data, right, in various forms. Uh, and what differs across these stories might be the kind of actors we are talking about. So there's a lot of conversation around private enterprises and how much data they have, how they can leverage it, etc. There's also conversation about using it in, say, policy making, right? So data that informs what kind of policies you make. There's also a data piece there. So this is a World Bank report that's looking specifically at the health sector. How do we use evidence and data in making those policies? And then there's been conversation about data / AI. It goes back and forth in governance, and how the use of that is going to lead to particular kinds of governance, improve governance, etc. Right? So these are all different actors. Everyone seems to be enmeshed in the story about data and the kinds of things it can lead to. Right? So let's step back a little bit and think about this thing that we call data, right? It goes through various phases. It's created, it's collected, it's aggregated increasingly, it's processed in different ways, it's disseminated in different ways, right? And the question that I really want to get at today is, are all of these processes neutral? And here we'll talk about neutral the way it was brought up yesterday, right? Can someone sort of remind me what we meant by neutral? Did this term come up yesterday? Do you remember? So it was brought up in the context of technology not being neutral. That was the argument that Vidisha was making, right? So those are some of the points that I want to go back to and start out with. So the politics of technological systems, right? Not good, not bad, but also not neutral, right? And can you guys think of examples of that before we get into the whole data story? What are examples of technological systems not being neutral? And let's try and stick to everyday technologies, right? Let's not get into the gun debate today, for example. Think of a technology that you would think of as being essentially neutral. And can you think of how it might not actually be neutral in whatever way? And we can discuss why you think it's not neutral. Less sexy technologies, older technologies that don't necessarily have to do with data in the same way. Because this is not a data thing, right? We're talking about the non-neutrality of any kind of technological system. So there's one famous or infamous example of a bridge in northeastern US that was built by this great builder called Robert Moses. Anyone heard of this? Especially those of you with a sociology / STS type background. So this is a fascinating story. It's been disputed. There have been, it's one of those things where people have written papers for and against. So there's actually been a conversation in academia around this one bridge. So the idea is that this was a bridge that was built, I think somewhere around the New Jersey Turnpike or something, if I'm not mistaken. And the point was that this was built, this had a flyover over that bridge, right? So this was basically a bridge that was going to the beach, but it was built under a bridge whose height was such that you couldn't actually have buses go through that, right? Any, why is this not neutral? Why would someone argue that this is not neutral? And what does that mean? So the argument being made here was that Robert Moses actually, on purpose in this case, designed this in such a way that people from lower income groups in the city could not go to the beach, and the beach could be left free for other people, because unless you had a car, you couldn't really get there and the buses weren't going there, right? And again, like I said, there's been a lot of dispute about if this is correct, if this is how they arrived at that, etc. But as an example of technology not being neutral, I think it's useful. Any ideas why green revolution might be called not neutral? Sure. Yeah, so today we need know that it leads to certain kinds of implications, but even for the use of that technology at that time, yeah. Required large amount of water to so makes it fair and like having a lot of water was very had a lot of water and even within a state, right, this requirement for inputs, whether it's pesticides or water, meant that certain kinds of farmers were more able to embrace it, right? And years later, now we see that. But also, there was interestingly a gender difference also, which was some of the equipment that came with the Green Revolution, including certain kinds of harvesters, etc., basically took away uh, jobs from the people who were doing it earlier. Very often this was women, right? And they would also get all kinds of leftover grain. Now a very efficient equipment actually meant that those leftover or fallen over grain didn't actually exist, right? So again, not I also want to make it clear here that we are not saying it was designed necessarily with bad intention, but it was designed with certain kinds of users in mind, and that then went on to not make it neutral, right? Anyone think sidewalks are not neutral? Your footpaths outside? This is a pet peeve, so I'm just taking this opportunity to bring it up. It might not apply at all. So you're basically talking about a situation where the sidewalk is made after clearing out people who are selling from there. Okay, fair enough. And what about after it's made? Are there people that it's more or less useful for? Accessibility? Yeah, so accessibility is a definite issue. In the Bangalore case, it's inaccessible to everyone. In that sense, it's pretty equal, because I don't know if you guys have stepped outside and seen the height of it. In fact, there's one right outside our institute where there is a step to the footpath, which I thought was quite interesting. Anyway, so just to point out the idea that technologies are not neutral, there's another aspect to this. We've been hearing a lot recently about this idea of human-centered design, right? But another way in which politics comes into this entire framing is, who are these humans we are talking about, right? Already when we were talking about the non-neutrality of technology, when you design, you typically design for someone. So who is that default user you're thinking about? Sometimes it might be a very focused, targeted population. At other times, it might just be the kind of default user you think is going to use it, right? So it might not necessarily be targeted. You think it's for everyone, but in your mind, when you're designing it, you bear a particular image of what the default user is. So I think it's also important to ask, who is the human at the center, even of more sensitive thinking design called human-centered design, right? Uh, and what I'm going to argue in all of this is that data steps in as what I call an anti-politics machine. Now, anyone know what an anti-politics machine is, or even before that, what an anti-gravity machine is, which sort of influenced the author coming up with this term? Ever heard the term anti-gravity machine? Or what does it sound like? What might an anti-gravity machine be? Defies. Okay, so you're there. It suspends gravity, right? So it's something that has been the stuff that sci-fi has been made of for a long time. And the anti-politics machine is a similar concept, which basically talks about the suspension of politics. Anyone encountered this term before? Because I know some of you have a development studies background. Yeah. Do you want to? No? Okay. All right. So this is something that comes out of the work of an anthropologist, James Ferguson, who is studying how a development project works in the nation of Lesotho. Anyone know where Lesotho is? So Lesotho is a country in Africa. It's completely surrounded by South Africa, right? It's a completely landlocked country. And his larger argument, we are of course not, his research is not what we are focusing at here, but basically he's talking about a development initiative that goes into Lesotho, sponsored by the World Bank, basically saying that, hey, the farmers here are risk averse. They don't know how to plant uh, their crops well, their agriculture is not doing very well, their incomes are low, they also don't seem to breed livestock. So let's make these farmers less risk averse. Let's teach them how to be better farmers. Let's see if we can get those incomes up. And long story short, he basically says that doesn't quite work out, etc., etc. But he says what happens in the process of framing what's going on in Lesotho as this problem that can be solved by these guys from outside coming in and proposing a technical fix, which in this case was, here are better ways to grow livestock, here are better ways to farm, is that they don't look at politics at all, right? And what does he mean by that? He says basically one of the reasons for people's poverty is not that they're landlocked and not going anywhere, but because of the particular ways in which they are connected to South Africa. So turns out there is a lot of labor migration from Lesotho to South Africa. They paid very bad wages, but changing these wages would require having a conversation with South Africa, which is obviously a much more powerful country, etc. So that's the kind of politics that's getting suspended here. But his larger point is that when you propose a technical fix, a technological fix to what is essentially a social and political problem, you do two things. One is you behave as though there is no politics, right? And there is actually a certain kind of politics that's created by the development initiative itself. That also you're not able to see. So this idea of going into a situation not being able to see the politics in it is what I'm going to run with for the rest of this talk, right? So is there a way in which data today is disallowing us in some ways from seeing the politics, right? So that is the idea that I'm putting out here, and let's see how far we get with it. All right. So if we start with data collection, right? And also just because once again, I have the stage, I can talk about whatever I feel like. Therefore, I will talk about fingerprinting because it's so interesting, right? Data collection is by far, it isn't like it started in the last 10 years, right? And states especially have been gathering data about their population for a really, really long time. If we look to colonial India, we see some of the earliest sort of innovations around technical ways, like technological innovations that are focused specifically at data collection, right? So we're going to go back a little bit and then come back to the present. So clearly what we call the state gaze or big data is not, it didn't happen only 20 years or 5 years back. This is a very nice picture of the social security system that was started in the US in the 1920s. And this is all the data that they collected and stored, right, which was big data in 1936. So we come to, I should actually not have, let's pretend like you didn't see that. Who knows what a vernier caliper is? Can you say a little bit more? What does it help you do? Right. So in the 19th century, though, it was part of what is called anthropometry, which is a way of measuring 11 bony parts of human bodies. And it was seen as a way to classify people, right? There is also a history here of the popularity of the science of eugenics at this time, which meant you were trying to connect people's physical characteristics to things like their intelligence or criminality. So this was actually fairly accepted, or at least it was seen as being at the cutting edge of novel science in some parts, right? So what happens in around 1879 happens first in France, but is then picked up as a method around everywhere, is called the Bertillon method. So basically this guy, André Bertillon, comes up with not just these 11 measurements, but also how to classify them. And basically this was seen as a way to quickly identify criminals, right? So that was one of the purposes to which this was being used. And this is how it looked. So you had very, very detailed measurements. So essentially what happened was, if you suspected someone of being a criminal, you would measure all these body parts, make a catalog card, and then there was a way in which you classified those cards. So the idea was, the next time you brought in someone, these were supposed to be unique, the 11 body parts together. So the next time you brought them in, you could presumably sort of connect and be able to identify them. So this is more of the same. And at about the same time, slightly earlier, there's also the development of fingerprinting, right? While anthropometry was mostly focused on criminality, data collection with fingerprinting actually began for a variety of civilian purposes. So saying that you sign on to a contract, that was one of the first purposes. And this was started in India with indigo plantation, right? So I just wanted to bring this up to get a sense of the various kinds of data that were being collected. But I think there's a larger point here, which is the point here is whose data and privacy, right? So when we talk about the politics of data collection, whose data was being collected here, and in what were the differences? Was everyone's data being collected? How were these decisions being made about which populations you were collecting this data about, right? So there are some very fascinating quotes here. So on Edgar Thurston, who was the curator of the museum in Madras, he basically says a visit to the government museum in Madras was always a pleasant experience, though at first alarming. Such was the author's zeal for anthropometry that he seized every man, woman, or child in order to measure them, right? But when someone tried doing this in London, it didn't quite go so well, and they were seeking voluntary experimental subjects, right? So you already see how the socio-political context of the time, which was colonialism, allowed for certain kinds of people to be made into subjects for this, and data about them was collected. Whereas in other cases, there was an understanding that you had to ask for permission. In France, every person arrested was measured by the police, but the keeping with the French-British cultural wars forever, they said that, but it would not be consistent with English ideas to entrust to the police an arbitrary power of measuring or photographing every person arrested without authority from magistrate and without regard to the necessity for the purposes of justice of discovering his antecedents and category. Anthropometric measurements were suggested as the best way to register and control tribes identified as criminal in India. So throughout, you see a distinction between whose data it was okay to take, who, in which cases you needed permission, who you even wanted to collect data about, right? So all of these were obviously reflective of the context of the time. Fingerprinting similarly, it was a compulsory signature for those executing deeds and contracts as well as other civil situations in parts of India. But it was used solely for criminals in Britain and in the US. And in the US case, for example, this author basically says it valued fingerprinting for its ability to decipher the masses of racially unfamiliar and thus menacing streams of newcomers to America's cities whom the state might have had an interest in knowing. Of course, this all doesn't feel that distant given what's happening both in the US and the Indian context today. But the point here is really to say that there is a socio-political context within which something like data collection is taking place, right? So if I say, where is the politics in this? What would you say? What are the different ways in which politics enters this conversation? Okay, so that might be how you take this forward, but I think even the decision to collect data and who you're collecting it about, right, is shaped by these kind of considerations about who can you do it with, who can you take these liberties with. It's essentially about relationships of control, of power, right? All of that comes into how you even conceive of data collection, right? So we obviously are looking at a slightly different time today in terms of who all is able to collect the data. Presumably, going around with a vernier caliper wasn't something that every private enterprise or individual could do, right? You needed state backing for some of these enterprises. But it's becoming increasingly clear, easier and cheaper for more and more people to be collecting this data. So this was a case from, I think, 2 or 3 years back in the US, where there was basically this driver, Uber driver, who was collecting data about every encounter that he had in his cab. Right? And he had a live YouTube channel on which he was streaming this. And this also went to court and so on and so forth. And strangely, the state where it happened apparently only need one person's permission for recording. So I have no idea what that is about. But the point here is that these were all people who were really upset when they found out about this. Not because there was like illegal or criminal activity or anything, but because you want to know when you're being recorded, right? You all know, for example, that this is happening, right? So the point here is that it's becoming easier to do some of this recording without anyone even knowing about it. You cannot have a vernier caliper to your head without knowing about it. That could not have happened. So some of these have shifted, but what hasn't shifted, I'm arguing, is that there is still a politics to whose data you collect, what you're able to do with it, etc. So and nor is this only about the building of technology. This was a famous case that happened, again, I think the data was from 2012, but I think it came out in 15 or 16. This is about how researchers use data, right? Researchers have more and more access to data. Does anyone remember this case? Come across it? No, this is not actually Cambridge Analytica. This was an academic study. Any idea what the controversy was about, even from reading this? So basically what researchers were doing was, some of them was within Facebook, they were trying to manipulate people's news feeds in particular ways. So they wanted to see what kinds of news feeds made people happy or unhappy, right? Which as a research goal might have been okay, but the way they achieved that was through actually changing people's news feeds. And the people did not know this was happening, right? So they were very, very upset, and there is till date there are debates about whether this was ethical or not, were the benefits of this research outweighing its costs, etc. So that brings us to another important point, which is that even in the state examples that you looked at, very often data collection is done because it's supposed to serve the public interest, right? You remember that discussion we had yesterday, right? About how when you weigh different options, how do you decide which one to go with? So the idea of public interest is something that comes up all the way. And it was also true here. For example, in the US, you have to go through a research ethics process to get your research cleared. And one of the things that we'll look at is whether the costs of the research, the benefits of the research are worth the cost that individual people have to take on, right? And this one, the jury is still out on this one. Lots of people were very upset with Facebook. There were lots of angry letters, etc., etc., right? All right. So the other kind of difference in how data gets collected today is the number of sources that are available and how you're able to aggregate it, right? So there's this notion of alternative data. Have any of you come across this idea of alternative data? No one? What might alternative data be? What's that? Proxies. And I guess one of the most important contexts in which they come up is this idea of credit scores, right? So I want to go on to this data aggregation and processing now, and I'll just play you a short video of what is called a fintech firm.
How much do you need to know about a person before you'd feel comfortable making a loan? Suppose you wanted to lend $1,000 to the person sitting 2 rows behind you. What would you need to know about that person before you'd feel comfortable? My mom came to the US from India in her late 30s. She's a doctor in Brooklyn, and she often lets friends and neighbors come to see her for health services, whether they can pay right away or not. I remember running into her patients with her at the grocery store or on the sidewalk, and sometimes they would come and pay her right on the spot for previous appointments. She would thank them and then ask them about their families and their health. She gave them credit because she trusted them. Most of us are like my mom. We would give credit to someone that we know or that we live next to, but most of us are probably not going to lend to a stranger unless we know a little something about them. Banks, credit card companies, and other financial institutions don't know us on a personal level, but they do have a way of trusting us, and that's through our credit scores. Our credit scores have been created through an aggregation and analysis of our public consumer credit data, and because of them, we have pretty much easy access to all of the goods and services that we need, from getting electricity to buying a home or taking a risk and starting a business. But there are 2.5 billion people around the world that don't have a credit score. That's a third of the world's population. They don't have a score because there are no formal public records on them, no bank accounts, no credit histories, and no social security numbers. And because they don't have a score, they don't have access to the credit or financial products that can improve their lives. They are not trusted. So we wanted to find a way to build trust and to open up financial access for these 2.5 billion. So we created a mobile application that builds credit scores for them using mobile data. There are currently over 1 billion smartphones in emerging markets, and people are using them the same way that we do. They're texting their friends, they're looking up directions, they're browsing the internet, and they're even making financial transactions. Over time, this data is getting captured on our phones, and it provides a really rich picture of a person's life. Our customers give us access to this data, and we capture it through our mobile application. It helps us understand the creditworthiness of people like Jennifer, a small business owner in Nairobi, Kenya. Jennifer is 65 years old and for decades has been running a food stall in the Central Business District. She has 3 sons who she put through vocational school, and she's also the leader of her local Chama or savings group. Jennifer's food stall does well. She makes just enough every day to cover her expenses, but she's not financially secure. Any emergency could force her into debt. And she has no discretionary income to improve her family's way of living, for emergencies, or for investing into growing her business. If Jennifer wants credit, her options are limited. She could get a microloan, but she'd have to form a group that could help vouch for her credibility. And even then, the loan sizes would be way too small to really have an impact on her business, averaging around $150. Loan sharks are always an option, but with interest rates that are well above 300%, they're financially risky. And because Jennifer doesn't have collateral or a credit history, she can't walk into a bank and ask for a business loan. But one day, Jennifer's son convinced her to download our application and apply for a loan. Jennifer answered a few questions on her phone, and she gave us access to a few key data points on her device. And here's what we saw. So bad news first. Jennifer had a low savings balance and no previous loan history. These are factors that would have thrown up a red flag to a traditional bank, but there were other points in her history that showed us a much richer picture of her potential. So for one, we saw that she made regular phone calls to her family in Uganda. Well, it turns out that the data shows a 4% increase in repayment among people who consistently communicate with a few close contacts. We could also see that though she traveled around a lot throughout the day, she actually had pretty regular travel patterns, and she was either at home or at her food stall. And the data shows a 6% increase in repayment among customers who are consistent with where they spend most of their time. We could also see that she communicated a lot with many different people throughout the day, and that she had a strong support network. Our data shows that people who communicate with more than 58 different contacts tend to be more likely to be good borrowers. In Jennifer's case, she communicated with 89 different individuals, which showed a 9% increase in her repayment. These are just some of the thousands of different data points that we look at to understand a person's creditworthiness. And after analyzing all of these different data points, we took the first risk and gave Jennifer a loan. This is data that would not be found on a paper trail or in any formal financial record, but it proves trust. By looking beyond income, we can see people in emerging markets that may seem risky and unpredictable on the surface are actually willing and have the capacity to repay. Our credit scores have helped us deliver over 200,000 loans in Kenya in just the past year, and our repayment rates are above 90%, which, by the way, is in line with traditional bank repayment rates. With something as simple as a credit score, we're giving people the power to build their own futures. Our customers have used their loans for family expenses, emergencies, travel, and for investing back into growing their businesses. They are now building better economies and communities where more people can succeed. Over the past 2 years of using our product, Jennifer has increased her savings by 60%. She's also started 2 additional food stalls and now making plans for her own restaurant.
Alternative data. Do you get a sense of what that is from here? What is the conventional data for creating a credit score, and what would be alternative data to arrive at the same thing? All right, let's take another step back. What is a credit score? Why do you need a credit score? Anyone? Right. So, yeah. So, and the credit score institutions are way more established in other countries, but the idea is every person has a credit score which is based on all kinds of financial transactions that they undertake, earlier loans they have taken. So these are things that people look at for a variety of purposes. Giving loans is one of them, right? So what is the argument that the founder of this fintech is making? Why don't credit scores work for people, conventional credit scores? Not recorded financial activities, right? So they haven't necessarily taken a loan from a bank in the past, therefore they don't have a credit score, therefore they won't get another loan, etc. And it's a very slippery slope from on there, right? And what is she saying is, what is the company that she's talking about, Tala, doing? How is it getting over this problem? So the idea is there are a lot of people like this who need money, who want to set up something, say, or for other reasons, who are not judged creditworthy because they don't have this credit history or a good credit score, right? But now she's saying there are other ways in which you can get data about who they are, how creditworthy they might be, right? Why is that? Where is that data coming from? And what is making it possible for these guys to know that? Because presumably she's always been doing that, right? But the banks weren't taking account of that. Why is that? What is the factor here? The technological factor? Hint. Yeah, she's talking about a mobile phone, right? So she's basically saying many of these people might not earlier even have had a bank account. So there's no history of their financial transactions. Now you have a mobile phone on which you have other kinds of transactions. What is a so from what I've said already about credit scores and how they might be calculated, is there a difference in the kind of data that's getting captured? Not just how or what makes it possible, but is there a difference in what kind of data is getting captured? What is the difference? And hence it's called alternative data, right? So that might be part of it. They actually cover a lot of ground. Every company is different. Essentially, their USP is how the credit score is different. Yeah. I was going to come to the question of bias, but from another direction. But how about this? Does richer data actually lead to the kinds of bias that more straightforward, uh, institutionalized banking transaction as we traditionally know it might not? Right. So as soon as you move beyond the directly financial transactions and incomes, a bunch of questions come up, right? I wanted to first set up the idea of why this is even being offered. Is that clear? Then we'll move on to sort of the flip side and what the issues are. So there are a lot of fintechs out there today, and the goal is that there are lots of people who are not able to get loans solely because they don't necessarily have a recorded credit history. Here is a lot of data that they are generating in other aspects of their life. Can we leverage that to give loans, right? So that is the basic idea. What the founder you just heard us say is it allowed them to give loans to someone who was not able to. So this is the best case scenario. They looked at all this data. They do it with informed consent, and we can debate at length about whether informed consent is really informed or consent, but that's not what we are going to do today. So they did all that and they decided this person was a thumbs up, we are going to give them a loan. Now let's look at someone who doesn't get that loan, right? It might be for a variety of reasons. These guys pointed out a couple, right? So there might be a very preliminary thing of we are assuming that the presence of that mobile phones are ubiquitous today. But of course, there are going to be people who don't have mobile phones. There might be shared access within a home, which means very often that the woman might have less access to it than the other person. There might be mixed patterns because people are using the phone, multiple people are using the phone. Then there are questions about the research on which some of this relies, right? The kind of correlations that they are making. What world was that taken from? And what happens if you don't fall into that for reasons that you can't ahead of time predict, right? Then there are other questions about how far will you go? What kinds of data is it okay for you to pick up, right? So is it okay to say, well, you spoke with a bunch of other people who might also have given you loans, and because they rejected you, I use that to say that I will not give you a loan. Is that okay from a banking institution's point of view? So there are also two points of view we have to look at here, right? One is the business itself, right? And one is the person who is getting or not getting the loan, right? And part of what is, I think, problematic about this, and you guys can jump in and see if you see anything else, is that if my loan were to be rejected, in most of these cases, you don't know why, right? So there's this particular issue of opacity that I think is much more accentuated today in the kind of data conversation that we are talking about, right? And what do I mean by opacity? It is that very often, any of you made a call center call recently to anyone, airlines, bank, etc. Any frustrating experiences? Any joyous experiences then? Part of what I'm trying to get at here is when you're talking to that person, or in this case, maybe the fintech company, if you ask why you haven't been given a loan, you basically told that your credit score is this in the best case scenario, or you might not even get to know what that score is, but you don't know what led to that, right? In almost none of these fintech companies can you actually say, this is why my score looks like this. Do I have a grievance redressal mechanism to all of that? And at the other end, the person who's sitting at the banking counter genuinely says, I don't know. The machine told me that. Is that an answer that people have got on call center calls or others, where the person at the other end of the phone basically says, I cannot do anything more, right? The machine has told me this is how it works. And the underlying assumption there is either I can't fix it, or if the machine said it, it must have had an internal logic to doing that, right? So that kind of a scenario, I think gets really problematic, because basically there might be a variety of reasons why your credit score looks the way it does. You might not have a phone. There might be very structural reasons why your connections are only so many. Yeah.
This one certificate, trying to my friend. He was trying to get an income certificate from the Tal Corporation. And what happened was, when we gave all the incomes and finally when we got the income certificate, the entire sum was very wrong. And when he went and approached and asked why is this sum wrong, just to get out of it. No, this is what we have got. When we went on pursuing to re-verify it, finally the person seen the main result said that actually these computers take the 6th month or the 12th month to put it into work. The machine does this. We can't change it. The machine does.
And this is actually a good case where you actually know, right, why it happened, even if it was after a lot of pursuing. So you knew where to go to. You had a person that you could repeatedly go back to and who chose to engage with you for whatever reason. They were also willing to dig into it a little bit and tell you why it was. Ultimately, you couldn't change the final result, but you could at least know what happened, right? Now, would you also know, since you bring this up, would you know how they could challenge this? Like, for example, now that they know this, is there actually a forum where they can go and say, well, this is why it doesn't work, right? So in some cases that might exist, but that's very few.
So yeah, so they have, so data.gov.in is currently running a hackathon where they have a public grievance redressal system, and it's based on manual forms which you fill up and give it to particular departments, and then they come up with a reason or whatever in a local language which tells you why something is rejected. Right now, the hackathon is about converting those systems into chatbots, right? And the problem with chatbots is why a certain thing is not applicable to me has very set definite reasons, just like you do in Uber. If you're canceling the ride, there are only 4 set reasons why you want to cancel the ride, and your case may not fit them. And so that creates, when we are designing to somebody who has done HCI here, we'll be creating personas and set options for them to deal with, and that doesn't give them the flexibility of not fitting into a case. So that's the problem.
And remember also that very often who is able to make some of these grievance redressal trips, or later on maybe a legal case, is also very skewed structurally, right? Not everyone will have the time or the resources to actually carry forth a long term conversation like this about grievance redressal, right? So there are a lot more such companies today, and I think what makes them different and interesting and also problematic is the variety of sources from which they gather the data, and they have very unique ways. In fact, very often that is their unique selling point, is how they put those different sources together to come up with a score. But almost never will you know how they make that score. Now, this is not to say that earlier banks you knew exactly how your credit score was getting calculated, but there were a couple of things that you knew. You knew that whatever they calculated was based on financial transactions, most probably because they won't have access to many other kinds of data. In some countries, it's also outside, it's illegal to use income or anything other than income or financial related data to generate credit scores that are used for other purposes other than for loans, right? But this makes it, I think, unique. And the reason again that I wanted to bring it up is, where is the politics? And here again, by politics, I mean, what are the kind of structural reasons that people might be generating certain kinds of data? Who are the people from whom you ask permission for these kind of things? What are the kind of people who might be affected disproportionately by it? Those are things that don't really come up when you're talking about how this data is used, right? In the video that you saw, obviously they were talking about how their company is doing well, so I don't expect her to bring it up. But I think as a community also, when you talk about how something is automated, your faith in it, it's hard to explain. There is a kind of an opacity because of which you're both not able to explain it, but at the same time there's also some kind of a faith in that system because it's supposed to be neutrally done, right? The argument that you hear very often is that the person who's sitting giving you a bank loan in the bank can discriminate based on your gender or caste or class because they're in front of you and they know you. And I'm not denying that, but the point is you can see that bias right there, right? But when it goes through a system like this, the reason fintech companies put it forward is precisely that this is just based on your data that we want. It has nothing to do with your caste or class or gender or any of the usual differentiators, and therefore we are less biased. And the point here is that there might still be all kinds of bias, except we are not able to see it. So that in a way makes it even harder and more opaque to find biases around, right? So I'm going to just put out a lot of examples here because I think each one of them is slightly different. So what we were looking at so far are different ways in which different kinds of data is aggregated. Here's another example which is more predictive though, right? And this is for work. So there is a company called, I'm forgetting the name, Predict Me, I think it's called. So basically babysitting services in the US. Again, the selling point here is that there has been a lot of child abuse and you want to be sure that you trust the person you employ as a babysitter. So what might be ways in which you do this? So they've come up with an app, I think it's, yeah, Predictim is what it's called. So basically, if you want to employ a babysitter, what you do is you get them to basically, I think the way it works is you have this app, you put that person's name, the app goes ahead and then searches all their social media profiles. You get permission from the potential hire for this. They search their social media profile for language, etc., to see and determine a score to say they'll be good or bad babysitters. Right? Now, what is really interesting about this is the way this company started. So they actually started out by helping people who are looking for jobs make a better social media profile for themselves. As many of you might know, increasingly, a lot of your potential employers are going to be looking at whatever trail you have left behind on the web, right? Especially social media, to see what have been your kind of interactions, what language do you use. It's just, it spans a wide variety of behavior, right? So they were trying to initially help out people to say, well, how do you keep yourself a clean profile? Or how do you manage this such that tomorrow if your potential employer looks at this, you still get a job, right? What language shouldn't you use, etc. But then they realized that where the market was probably on the other side. Now, new parents, as everybody knows, are very hard to please, right? And they are very particular about how to ensure their child's safety. So if you go further into like the sales pitch for this company, they completely draw on that fear, right? So even how this app progressed is very interesting. So initially when they built it, what they would do is they would get the the employer to be to send an email asking for permission from the person they wanted to hire, saying, hey, can we look at your social media profile? But then these employers told them that, hey, it's very uncomfortable for me to write to someone telling them, can I look at your social media profile? Because it seems, it just feels like I don't trust the world kind of a thing. And it's a very uncomfortable interaction to have. So can we change that? So basically then what the company did was it started pinging the employee directly, asking them that if they wanted to be vetted for this job, they need to share the social media profile, right? And there's a bunch of stuff that's come. This is what it looks like. It gives you a low risk to high risk meter. And what they have also found is that given this is babysitting, even if you are, near low risk, nobody wants that. They want a perfect babysitter, right? So unless you make the absolute green, it's very unlikely that someone's going to give you a job. Now, where are problems here? Clearly, there is a purpose, which is that you want your baby to be safe. which I don't think anyone is going to push back against. What is the problem with something like this? And there might be different kinds of problems, right? So they would argue that, look at some of the things on the list, right? It says drug abuse, explicit content, disrespectful attitude, bullying, and harassment. Well, if you clearly, yeah, if you're like, Facebooking with your drug dealer, maybe, or with other buddies about where you can get the next stash. So that is not entirely clear, but the idea is that if someone writes in a particular way, sounds like a bully, they are probably a bully. Now, there's a small point here that is very important. Very often, the average age of the babysitters in the context we are talking about is probably like late teens, right? Probably not the best time to judge you by your social media content, right? So, on the one hand, you might have people whose language is being adversely interpreted to mean that they are threatening. On the other, and this is based off of your point, you might have a perfectly respectful attitude, whatever that means on social media, won't tell you a whole lot about how you're going to be with the baby. Now, this gets further complicated by the fact that social media and this kind of language analysis is very often, as I'm sure all of you are aware, you need a data set on which to train it to say that something is respectful versus disrespectful. And this can bias it in further ways. For example, the way Black Americans talk might be very different than the way other racial groups talk. And it might just be slang, right? There is a very, for us, it's a very clear line between slang and being disrespectful. But for someone who's reading it without context, that's very, very, very hard to get. And this is something that technologists and computer scientists will tell you, that interpreting this is very hard. But the reason I bring this up is because, again, here in an app, you're basically showing a certain degree of confidence in interpreting a person's personality based on some of their actions, right? And what they find is that people then get a little more hesitant. So even if you're low risk, but like 2, not 1, people find it hard to hire you, right? Because they feel like some unbiased party has told you that they might pose a certain amount of risk. So would you want to cross that and actually hire them? And this person who's written this article went ahead and did a lot of, put in the names of all the people they know, etc., to find out what their risks are. And there are very few people that they found who were very, very low risk. And again, there was a certain racial component to it, etc. Again, what makes this really interesting is because of the kind of conversations we've been having about bias, when this person goes and talks to the person who started this company, the first comment they make is that we do not do racial profiling, right? So your very starting point is that we are not biased against along these dimensions that you might expect a human being to be biased around. Therefore, we are actually going to be a much more neutral arbitrator in all of this. And yet there are these underlying factors, which means that the historical data sets that you draw from will likely influence the kind of interpretations that you make, right? So anyway, there's a lot more around hiring. I thought you guys might all be looking for jobs. So here's something that you want to keep in mind, whether or not you agree with it. All right. So here's one more case. This is from a child abuse prediction point of view. This is something that was deployed in Allegheny in northeastern US. A lot of the research, unfortunately, does come from the US, though there's some amount coming up in India as well. But I think the point that they're trying to make here is very interesting. So what happens here is this is basically a department called Child, CYF, which is, okay, I don't actually have it, don't worry about it. All right, so this is basically a child abuse hotline. So if you feel like a child is being abused for whatever reason, you live in their lane, you see some suspicious activity, etc., you can call a child abuse hotline. What happens at the hotline is there's basically an algorithm that pulls together a bunch of information about this child that you're calling about, or the family that you're calling about, and gives a threat score. Now, this threat score basically tells the person who's taking up the call whether or not they should pursue this complaint, right? Because someone might have heard something that's one-off, maybe it's not a big deal, there is no history saying this child is in danger, and you have a limited number of people that you can send out there to investigate, right? So given all these constraints, seems reasonable. They even, this is not even a mandatory thing. So it's not that if the threat score is very high, you have to go out, or if it's very low, you are not allowed to go out. There is a human intermediary who's taking that call, who's using this to make a decision, right? Once again, what they find is basically what the author does is she sits with this person and she basically makes her calculate a score independently, and then it also runs on the computer. And even though the person is sort of sure before she sees the score that this one is not worth bothering about, this one probably yes, because the computer says otherwise, she gets a little jittery, right? So that point remains the same. Now, what's the point with the what's the sort of bias or skew in this data set that it uses? So essentially, the score is calculated on a bunch of parameters that include things like how many times before has that family called into the child. Here's where the name of the department would have been crucial, but I'm forgetting it. So basically, this is a department that both looks at child abuse, it hosts that hotline, but also provides certain kinds of parental support services. So for instance, you have to go out work, there's no one to look after your kid. This is a public department that gives you subsidized or free daycare, right? So this is also the same department. So if you've called this department about things like that, or needing any kind of help with your child support, that will actually feed into your score, right? So with just this much, what do you think might be a problem with the way the score is generated, or how might it look different for different kinds of people in that community? So who is likely to call up for subsidized daycare? More broadly, yeah, lower income, right? So you wouldn't typically go to subsidized daycare unless you had no other means to make daycare happen, right? So you can already see that a certain section of the population is likely to have called in more to this hotline. So anyway, so on the one hand, that's happening. On the other hand, what is also happening is that if you are able to avail of these services, as well as maybe other kind of counseling services, right, which is the other thing that these guys are keeping tabs on, is there domestic abuse, not necessarily of the child, but are there separated parents, is there family tensions, have they been to public counselors, etc. On the other side, if you're actually able to afford going to private practitioners for this, your record is not on the system, right? So it actually works both ways. So on the one hand, you're oversampling one population merely because it's called you more often in other contexts, not necessarily abuse. On the other, you're undersampling people who might actually have higher threats for the child, but it's just that they have taken their problems elsewhere, right? So again, not to sort of belabor the point, you see a certain opaqueness in what is happening, right? There it is. Child, youth and families. I wasn't too far off. All right. Yes, as apparently my next slide shows. All right. So the author of this, Virginia Eubanks, is basically making a larger point, which is that couple of centuries back, you had this idea of a poor house. And she is basically saying, are we creating a digital poor house? In some of these cases, in many of these cases, you're essentially dealing with people who need state welfare. And we are requiring that in order for them to get welfare, they trade off certain kinds of data, right? So it might be informed consent in the sense that you're signing off on a piece of paper, but what choice do people really have? So she's basically saying that welfare required that poor people trade their rights to bodily integrity, safe work environments, mobility, political participation, privacy, and self-determination for meager aid for their families. So the questions for us to ask really are, is privacy valued? How are its costs and benefits evaluated? And for who? How are people making these trade-offs? At the other end, what are the consequences of this data being collected, right? One, we already discussed how useful is the score, how reliable is it, so there is that. But also, imagine that this is what happens, that the number of times you call actually affects whether or not someone, and there are consequences to someone from that department reporting at your place. So, for example, if someone comes a certain number of times, they can actually take the child away to foster care. So, we are talking about a really high stakes situation, right? So, what might be something that people start doing once they know this is how the score is calculated? It's fairly simple, right? You'll stop calling that department for any kind of services. You decide, I'll figure out other ways. Now, is that something that you were really trying to do? If the whole point of this department is to help out people who might not always have alternative ways of supporting childcare, you're basically turning them away. This was definitely not what you intended to do with what you set up, but that ends up being one of the consequence of it, right? And once again, the redressal part is very, very complicated given how opaque it is. How are you going to go back? And I'm talking about a general sense that people might get, saying, hey, if these guys have showed up many times before at my house, it likely means they'll show up again. But you don't necessarily know what the components of that are, right? So how will you challenge a decision like this? And again, what kind of a route do you have to take to get to that, and who's able to do that? So those are all points that come up yet again. Now there's also some more stuff around predictive policing. Uh, there's one in the US. There's also in India, there are a couple of face recognition systems that operate in the policing space. Anyone heard of either of these? There's one called Face Tagger in Chennai. Anyone know what it does? Face Tagger? Any clues? Police department. Yeah. So basically, they use pictures of people to run it up against a database that they already have. I think the Chennai thing is still sort of in its trial stages, if I'm not mistaken. There's a more fleshed out one that operates in Punjab, where I think they have over 100,000 photographs, and basically they take a picture of someone they suspect, and they're able to run it against that. Now, this is a complicated case because on the one hand, the obvious problems are there for all of us to see, right? You might say it doesn't do good matching, it won't do good matching, especially for particular kinds of populations, etc. What happens with Face Tagger, for example, and I think even the Punjab ones are planning to go further, where they're going to look at how people gesture, etc., to also take that in. Because there are certain things that indicate that you're about to commit a crime. I'm not sure how it works, but there is that. There are proposals that they'll tie it into Aadhaar, etc. So the problem with a lot of this is very often this relies on people who look like suspects. So Face Tagger, for example, says you can take a picture of someone who looks like a suspect. Now, whether in India or the US context, the crime departments have typically had an idea of who looks more like a suspect than who else, right? So once again, you just see a lot of space where those kinds of biases can creep in, right? The previous case actually is interesting because Face Tagger is like very out there. This thing called Predpol is actually very interesting. So it doesn't actually work on people's faces. They work on geographies. So they have, they look at areas and see how much crime has been reported there, and they do more intensive patrolling there. So on the surface, that actually looks pretty safe, right? Or at least safer than what I was talking about faces. But what so this is from a book by Cathy O'Neil called Weapons of Math Destruction. So her argument here is that crimes again themselves are of different kinds, right? So you might have the burgling and manslaughter and things like that. But you also have much smaller things that are also classified as crimes. It might include buying a small quantity of drugs, for example, right? Or there might be other more local definitions of crime. Now, if you populate your the data that you're using for this includes both kinds, you basically mean it basically means that you're patrolling areas regardless of whether it's crime type 1 or 2, and Her argument is that if you keep patrolling an area, you're bound to find some crime or the other. It might not be burgling, but you will notice things that would otherwise never have gotten reported. And again, this falls in line with the demographic of that geography, because small amounts of drug peddling, etc., or if you end up, puncturing a car's wheels or any of those lower level misdemeanors, uh, might happen more in lower income areas, or historically that's what the data says, right? So even something that's very unproblematic looking on the surface, face tagger, I think just reading about it you can think of some of the problems, but even something that's more geography based can have these sort of things that are harder for you to think about unless you actually know that space really, really well. One last thing that I wanted to bring up just in terms of how data works. So most of the time now we are talking about data being collected about someone, and then that data is being used to monitor them. Now there's this idea of refractive surveillance, which basically means that you're actually collecting data about one population, but it's helping you monitor someone else. And one example of that is something like a retail store. So in a retail store, they might be tracking you intensively as a customer for various things. Where are you? There are retail stores where they know what path you take, what you pick up, what you put down. This could be through CCTVs. They have other kinds of technologies, beacons, etc. also, which help with this. Other things that you check online and offline because you might have a login with the store, etc. But in many of these, the workers, the customer care agent that you meet, their data also can either be inferred or actually also captured, right? If you have a CCTV capture of an interaction, and or even if you're doing something like you're just looking at the customer's face and their satisfaction or whatever, it's actually a reflection on the person that served them, right? So this kind of data is increasingly also used to monitor the workers, not just the customers. And that has certain kinds of consequences for them. And I think I'm running a little out of time, so I won't go to this. So to sort of bring some of this together, where should one look for the politics, right? Given that we've been talking about how one of the things that data seems to serve is to make the process and the politics more opaque, where does one start looking for the politics, right? So how are problems identified? The reason I brought up the Nanny app was because the problem actually came from the fact that the company already had a technology in which it could mine social media writings, right? And from there, and from the fact that there is actually a population that's very, very sensitive to who they hire, it sort of puts it together, right? And after that, whether you ask for consent from the person who you are hiring or the person who's doing the hiring, again becomes about who you see as your customer, right? And who is the other person who's basically serving your customer. How are these solutions designed and tested? When we talk about privacy and choice, which we all do increasingly, whose privacy and choice are we talking about? Because any of these encounters includes multiple people. Who are you designing for, right? We talk also about collateral damage. So you say, well, this technology is just developing, it's going to take some time, but what happens in the meanwhile, right? And how much of that are you willing to take? What data sets are used for training? Cathy O'Neil has this beautiful phrase where she says data scientists are stitching the status quo of the social order into models. She says this in the context of the Predpol application. What is being measured? How reliable are proxies? So for example, in the CYF case, you're basically measuring calls for support and working that into scores for how likely is child abuse. And the two are not always interlinked, right? And the interesting thing here is also, are you actually leading to a certain kind of situation? So it's not just that you're collecting certain people's data, uh, providing your services only to certain sections, not to others, etc. It's about how are you actually changing the terrain on which these everyday transactions are taking place. So I already talked about the Predpol case where excessive patrolling means you actually find more crime because you might classify things that were otherwise unseen as crime. That then goes back into the data set, which then shows you that this area has more crime, and you set more people on that patrol and so on and so forth. Or in the CYF case, it might lead to people just avoiding the public department, which provides them certain kinds of subsidized services, which was not your initial goal anyway. And then finally, what I've been sort of harping on, the opacity of scores and the opportunity to contest such decisions. Do you even know that you have an opportunity to contest it? Or is a score just a given? That's just what will come out at the end of the process, right? I just also wanted to tie this up quickly to what Bidisha was saying yesterday about the connection between morality and politics. And she made this connection in two ways, right? One was the very idea of what is moral is politically mobilized in some ways, right? And is data now feeding into this equation is the question that I'm really asking. Is the fact that you're using data in particular ways actually making you see certain things as more moral than others? The second point that she made was about how everyday and banal what we are, in retrospect, it's very easy to call certain things evil, right? But in the way that they get constituted, it happens in a very routinized, everyday sort of a way. Is that something that's happening? And whether as designers or as users of this system, over time, what happens is we tend to see certain things. Remember what I was saying about the default user, right? Who you essentially think you're designing for. Other things are then, you also design for those things in order to help you find a primary default user. So who are those people that you see, and who do you not see every time you see one person? And where does data fit into any of this? And this is also something I've been working on independently. But this is where is this idea of, when you think about invisibility, what kinds of people, what kinds of actions, and what kinds of existing infrastructures are you seeing or not seeing? So around the Predpol case, one very interesting point that the author makes is the focus of policing has always been on low income populations, right? And interestingly, she is someone who is a mathematician. She was working in Wall Street during the whole recession. So she talks about, I never see that kind of enthusiasm for going after white collar crime. So even your choice of what is this problem that you're choosing to solve, right? Which of those do you see and what do you not see? Why and for who? These are questions we keep asking. So probably familiar with them by now. Can we learn to see what is invisible? And of course, this is where we get more and more vague, because the good and bad part of the time we are in is that it's in some ways early days yet. So the hope is that some of these things can change, but it also means that we don't necessarily always have concrete examples of how they work differently. That said, there have been some things around the refractive surveillance thing I was talking about. For instance, one of the things that they do is looking at the number of customers that come in at any point to the store. They change their workers' schedules accordingly. And this makes workers' schedules very unpredictable. But in some stores, what they have done is they have allowed workers to jump in themselves and also work on which slots they want to use, right? So there are small ways in which some of this can look different. But there are sort of broader, more abstract things that is worth keeping in mind, which is again about who do you see, not see. I think history has given us some indication of who are the people that are typically not seen. So at the very least, are those groups that you're keeping in mind. Politics, I think I've said enough about this. Many people have worked on how do you see this better. I think Amit maybe spoke to you a little bit about participatory and inclusive design yesterday. Consultations in all of these cases that I've spoken about, not in one have any of the potential users ever been consulted, even at a baseline, right? So you are actually really designing for an imagined other. You have no direct interactions with them. Very important also to remember who you are, right? Sometimes I think people get so taken by good intentions that you feel like if your intentions are good, you must be doing the right thing. Absolutely not the case. Anyone heard the proverb, the path to hell is paved with good intentions? I think a very good thing to keep in mind, right? So who you are is always going to affect who you choose to see, who you're not able to see. So at the least, let's think about that. Think about who do we interact with on an everyday basis, who do we not, right? There's also been a lot of push for accountability and for regulations to ensure that people are accountable. You can hold people liable in case of wrong decisions, etc. You guys are probably, you're all aware of something like GDPR, where there is actually a specific clause where you can ask for a human being to intervene in decision making if the decision making has been automated. So there is definitely a lot of effort that's going on. One thing that technologists are doing is asking for technology audits. So very often, many of these problems that I'm pointing out, it has nothing to do with the fact that I'm not building that technology. Technologists themselves also have lots of, they've pointed out exactly similar issues around the trade-off, say, between fairness and efficiency or fairness and accuracy. And I think you'll hear more about this in the afternoon. So there's also that space to join in and carry out some conversation. So I think with that, I'm right out of time. Again, something that I'm very fond of is this oath of non-harm from Virginia Eubanks' book. And I think there are things that are very interesting here. All of it is interesting, but some of it, two of them are very interesting for me. The first, which says, I'll respect all people for their integrity and wisdom, understanding that they are experts in their own lives and will gladly share with them all the benefits of my knowledge, etc. I will design with history in mind. To ignore a 4-century-long pattern of punishing the poor is to be complicit in the unintended but terribly predictable consequences that arise when equity and good intentions are assumed as initial conditions. So I would really like for all of you to keep this in mind. With that, I will shut up, and if there were any questions, we can take them now or over coffee, whatever works.